Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever it is where you are. We're glad to have you with us today. We are the Center for Trade and Economic Integration, which is an interdisciplinary center at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. We do history, law, and politics applied to trade. I'm one of the co-directors, along with Professor Joost Pauwelen, who's one of the best known international trade lawyers in the world, and now Professor Cédric Dupont, political science professor, is also joining us. So this seminar is going to be about economics. It's going to be about the trade collapse, as all of you, I'm quite sure. And I'm going to just do a couple housekeeping before I very quickly introduce our speakers, and then we'll go straight through to the talks. So this session will be recorded and we will post it online afterwards on YouTube. And there will be a Q&A session after the talks. We're going to do 4 talks in a row and then Q&A. So please send in questions already as you hear them from each speaker. I have that list in front of me and I can look at that. So what we're going to actually start with is a poll about how you think about the great trade crisis. So Tamara, can you put that poll up? I'm not actually sure how it works. Okay, here we go. So everybody should be seeing this poll. And the first question is, will world trade fall more in 2020 than it did in 2008, 2009? And the second one is, will COVID-19 encourage more or less cooperation in the world trade system in 2021 than there was in 2019. So please, everybody vote. Oh, hosts and panelists cannot vote. Oh, I guess I can't vote, but everybody else can vote. So please vote on that one. And I will read out the results as Q&A starts. Okay, so the marching order, Tamara, if you could bring up the slide with all the speakers' names on it, that would be great. So the first speaker is going to be Robert Koopman, Bob Koopman, as most of you will know him as. He's the chief economist at the WTO, right now working busily on COVID transparency issues and announcements of policies. The second speaker will be Professor Simon Evenett, who's a professor at the University of St. Gallen. I should have also mentioned that Bob Koopman is also a professor here at the Graduate Institute teaching trade as well. The third speaker will be Anabel Gonzalez, a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics, but she's actually joining us from Costa Rica. She was former trade minister of Costa Rica, had many positions at the World Bank and other places. And then I will be your final speaker. I'm a professor at the Graduate Institute of International Studies, among other things. So I will pass it straight over to Bob to get started. Tamara, if you could bring up Bob's slides, that would be great. Okay, Bob, you're on.
Everybody can hear me? Yes, okay. I'm going to run through some slides here talking about our recent trade forecast, where from this chart you can see that we forecast with the lines, the green line and the red lines to the far right, pretty significant decline in global trade. The green line represents an optimistic scenario, the red line a pessimistic scenario. In the optimistic scenario, we expect the volume of merchandise trade to decline by about 12%. In the pessimistic scenario, about 32%. We do hope for, expect a recovery in 2021, and then as best we can expect more normal behavior out to 2022. A couple of interesting points here. If you look at the left-hand side, you'll see a gray line, gray dotted line, which represents the trend trade growth building up from the long 1990s, which was a period of great opening up in India, China, formerly centrally planned economies, multilateral liberalization, regional trade agreements, unilateral liberalization, where we had very rapid trade growth well above long-term average. However, if you look at the yellow dotted line to the right there, that's been trade growth since the great financial crisis. It's been quite a bit slower. And it's actually been slower than the long-term average trade growth rate if you go back, say, to the 1960s. In our scenarios, in the optimistic scenario, we return to that yellow or orange dotted line. In the pessimistic scenario, we stay well below it. Next slide, please. This gives you some idea of the GDP effects that we estimate in our underlying economic model that helped inform the trade costs. You can see that there's wide variation across the world. These are deviations from baseline trend. They're not deviations from the year before, but you can see we expect in a V-shaped, our optimistic scenario, a 5% decline in GDP. In the L-shaped scenario, which is essentially our pessimistic scenario, we expect a decline of about 11% from trend, with variations across the world. These numbers actually line up very well with what the IMF came out with in their WEO a couple days after our analysis, but you can see that there's quite a bit of variation around the world. Next slide, please. This gives you some idea of the relationship between trade growth and GDP growth historically, and it's one of the reasons why we didn't use the underlying simulation model to do our trade forecast. The simulation model for trade gives us a very constant relationship between trade and GDP, whereas you can see historically it's varied. On the left-hand side, you see trade elasticities above 2 over 3, which represents that great opening up period. In the great financial crisis in the middle, you see a number of 6.3. The trade decline was 6 times greater than the GDP decline. And you can see in our trade forecast period on the far right that we expect in a trade elasticity somewhere between 1.5 and 5. Although I have to say that we don't give that's not a 95% confidence interval. It very well could go above the pessimistic scenario in terms of the decline, or it could be less than the optimistic scenario. Next slide, please. This gives you some idea of how we went about modeling this. In our model, we shocked labor supply, so that affected every sector. We also then hit supply and demand in our model, keeping in mind that our model has global input-output structure and global interconnectivity of trade. And we went about looking at the literature to figure out how best to calibrate the labor supply shocks, the sectoral demand and supply shocks. And then we also looked at trade costs with some complicated estimations there to figure out what might happen with trade costs. Next slide, please. And here you can see a summary of the trade cost calculations. They may not look like much. If you look on the bottom right side, you'll see 3.4% ad valorem tariff equivalent in terms of trade costs. But if you consider that the global average tariff is around 8%, that's about a 40% tariff hike in the global average from those increase in trade costs. Next slide, please. In terms of the contributions of the various shocks to the outcomes, you can see in the middle, the red circle tells you that trade costs in the optimistic V-shaped scenario had the biggest impact on trade of about 34% contribution to the decline in trade, whereas trade costs only contributed about 20% to the decline in GDP. The blue circle on the left tells you that in the optimistic scenario, the biggest shock to GDP was a result of the labor supply reductions from workers not being able to go to work, people having to stay home for homeschooling, those kinds of things. On the bottom right-hand side, in the, in the pessimistic scenario, you'll see that the sectoral, what we call shifts, these are sectoral shocks to supply and demand from people not being able to go out and buy things, from the supply shocks, from supply chain disruptions, those kinds of things. Those have the biggest contribution to both GDP and trade in the L-shaped scenario. Next slide, please. So how might this pandemic bring about strategies for future risk mitigation. So the way that I look at this and the way that we'll do some future modeling on this is that firms, households, and governments are going to need to evaluate a risk versus efficiency trade-off. The risks for firms are that they'll have to think inventories. As you know, for the last 20 or 30 years, many firms have been driven to just-in-time inventory. They might have to consider larger inventories for critical parts. They might have to think about supply chain diversification to minimize the risk of relying on one particular producer in one particular location, whether, by the way, that's international or domestic. I mean, yes, international or domestic. They'll probably also be thinking about production, how much automation and digitization might they introduce so that they are less reliant on workers that may be locked down as a result of a health pandemic. So that's, I think, the risk versus efficiency calculation for them. For governments, how they might manage demand spikes above average supply. Will they build and manage emergency stockpiles in ways that taxpayers and citizens can afford and accept? And I think there's a big role for trade there, because trade can help you build those emergency stockpiles with a great deal of cost efficiency. Will they build flexible domestic production and or international insurance production agreements where they will maintain unused productive capacity or an ability to switch production quickly into the needed goods? Governments will also consider tracking and tracing, which has big implications for the digital economy. And then I think there's a great deal of uncertainty as to the requirements of the next pandemic or crisis. If the next pandemic is more of an Ebola type health crisis, or if it's a climate crisis, the kinds of actions that you might take for a respiratory pandemic is not necessarily going to help you with those. Again, this is a risk versus efficiency trade-off. My last point, my closing point, is households are going to have to consider options for remote work. They're going to have to think about privacy with that tracking and tracing, the ability to social distance and earn income that goes to the remote work, and how will they get critical services, education, healthcare, et cetera, if they're located at home in social isolation. That's going to have a big implication for the digital economy. And then how do they access and purchase necessary products while isolated? Again, implications for a digital economy. And I'll close there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob. So our next speaker straight up is Simon Evenett. And if Tamara, if you could pull up the slides for Simon. I also forgot to thank Tamara Pionete for arranging this, doing all the footwork for it. And thank you very much, Tamara. Simon, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard, and it's a great pleasure to be here. GDP is falling sharply in many countries. Conventional wisdom has it that when we have sharp economic recessions, protectionism follows. I want to use the data from the global financial crisis that we saw in 2008 and 9 to inform a discussion about what we might expect next. I will put the developments of this year in perspective, looking back, comparing 2020 with 2009 and 2010. And then I want to look at the dynamics which tend to unfold after a global economic shock. Next slide, please. On my first slide here, I have the composition of different types of trade distortions which are introduced year by year in and around the last global economic shock, which was the global financial crisis. I also have the data for 2020, and I've also put in 2019 as a bit of a benchmark. I want you to take away three things from this particular chart. First, notice the huge amount of red in the column for 2020. That represents a large share of global trade distortions this year are in export limits. Those are export bans, export curbs, export authorization schemes, principally in the area of medical products and medicines, and also somewhat in food. This is an unusual feature of this year, and you can see it differs from last year and from the 2009-2010 crisis response. The second thing I want you to take from this particular chart is look at the 2009 column. Tariff increases, subsidizing exports, and subsidizing import competing firms accounted for 60% of the trade distortions witnessed in that year. So the crisis response really revolved around these three policy instruments. Now, of these three, only the import tariffs are the ones which are most salient. And many people writing about that era feared that we would see a surge in tariffs like we did in the 1930s. What I want you to do, the third thing I want you to take away then from this particular chart is look at how much of the protectionism in 2009 and 2010, the crisis response, were different types of subsidies, either subsidies for exporters or subsidies subsidies to prop up import competing firms. Now, I should add that the data I'm showing you here, these are subsidies and bailouts principally for manufacturers and for farmers. So the data here has not been distorted by the financial sector bailouts, which were a concern back then. We could go on to the next slide. Here, what I have is the data from 2009 showing you how much trade was covered by different types of trade distortions. And the import tariff increases we saw in 2009 covered less than 1% of world trade. So for the analysts who broke open the champagne and said, hey, the world trading system did a great job holding back tariffs and not repeating the mistakes of the 1930s, I agree with them. That was not a key feature of the 2009 policy response. Instead, what we saw were much more under the radar screen subsidies, both to import competing firms and, more importantly, to firms that were exporting. And many of these subsidies were implemented through national tax systems, through various tax breaks. If you add up all of the trade distortions which were introduced in 2009, it turns out that by the end of that year, 36% of world trade had been affected or was covered by different types of trade distortions, which gives you a sense then of the scale of the protectionist response that we saw back in 2009. And of course, if the shock this time round is going to be larger in GDP terms and possibly larger in terms of initial world trade falls, then this may make you fear that we will have a sharper, larger response this time around. If we can go on to my final slide, that would be appreciated. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with is the idea that when we have a global economic shock, for sure we get a crisis response, 1 or 2 years of frenzied policymaking, and we have seen the the trade policy did respond. It was mainly policies which subsidized producers rather than restricted trade. But the point I want you to take from these particular charts is that the last global economic crisis started a process of considerable buildup of trade distortions in the world trading system. And on the left-hand side, I have a chart showing the share of world trade that is covered by different types of trade distortion, which were in place in each year. And so this tracks when policies went into force, came out of force, and that's why sometimes you occasionally see some of these lines trend downwards, not just upwards all the time. Now, what you can see on the left-hand chart then is that starting at the top of the top line, you can see that there was a jump in terms of world trade covered by trade distortions, and this has progressively increased over time, so that by 2020, more than 75% of global trade is affected by a trade distortion which was introduced since the global economic crisis began and is still in force today. So this gives you a sense of the buildup that we may well expect this time around. We should not expect a crisis response and then nothing more after that. The chart also shows that the amounts of world trade which were affected by subsidy measures were much larger than for tariff increases. And of course, the tariff increases cover more and more of world trade, especially once the trade war began in 2017. So that's one big takeaway from this chart. The second chart on the right-hand side shows you not just the scale of world trade affected, but the build-up in terms of the number of hits that each type of trade flow is facing. And you can see that darker and darker red elements show more and more trade is being hit more and more often. So it's not just a matter of more world trade being distorted, but more trade being hit more often by trade distortions. And this reinforces the impression then that we had a big change in trade policy dynamics after the global financial crisis. So what does this mean for today? I think we should not necessarily see an import tariff increase. It's quite possible the trade distortions will emerge in other areas. And furthermore, we should not expect this to be a one-off 2020, 2021 dynamic. We may well see further distortion to the world trading system, adding on top of the trade distortions which have accumulated over the past 10 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. Everybody's keeping to time very beautifully. Next speaker up is Anabel Gonzalez. Please, Anabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Richard. I will talk about what trade policies are needed to fight, recover, and rebuild from the COVID-19 pandemic. But before doing that, I will just mention a bit what is the context in terms of the estimated impact of the COVID-19. The estimated impact of COVID-19 on growth, Bob mentioned it, the IMF expects that global growth will decrease by -3% this year. Next slide, please. If we look at trade, Bob also mentioned estimated decrease anywhere between 13% and 32% or more. Next slide. UNCTAD has come out, and OECD as well, with some estimates for FDI in terms of -30 to -40% expected during 2020 to 2021. And next slide, most importantly, in terms of the estimated impact of COVID-19 on poverty, the World Bank estimates that 49 million people will be pushed to extreme poverty as a result of the pandemic, which is about the equivalent of having all of Spain falling into extreme poverty. So these are, of course, very dire consequences. Next slide. So in this context, governments have been undertaking a number of policy measures in different areas, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and others. And the question is, so what role for trade policy, first to help fight COVID-19? And here I think it's important to understand what is the policy outcome that we are trying to achieve, because this should guide our responses to the pandemic. And in my view, a main policy outcome to fight the virus should be improved timely access to sufficient and affordable critical supplies. So here we have, and we've heard from Simon about all this accumulated restrictions, and some 80 countries, according to a WTO report that came out yesterday, have imposed export restrictions. So one may think that as so many countries are doing this, maybe this is the way to go. But this poses some problems. First, of course, export restrictions hurt people in importing countries. And it's important to note that the world relies on top 3 exporters for critical medical gear to fight COVID-19. So if all of these countries impose bans, this is very bad news for the rest of the world. But they also hurt exporting countries. They increase prices, they discourage investment over the long run, and they invite retaliation. And this is a movie that we have seen before with the 2007-2008 food export restrictions, which basically ended up increasing prices and volatility. So next slide. If this is not the way to go, well, how is it that trade policy can help fight the virus? And again, we're trying to achieve the same policy outcome. So there are, in this context, a number of trade policy objectives that are relevant. Reducing time and cost to trade, reducing trade policy uncertainty, reducing time and cost to entry into market, incentivize capacity expansion and increase production, and facilitate cross-border movement of critical services and digital knowledge. So what are some of the measures that can be adopted in the area of trade to achieve these objectives, and most importantly, the policy outcome that I was mentioning? And here first we have the reduction and elimination of tariffs and other internal taxes and duties on health and hygiene products. We also have the expediting of customs inspection and release of goods. A number of countries have established green lanes to do this. This is important. Expanded access to technical standards and expedited conformity assessment procedures. The issue of quality is an important one here, and it should be part of the policy responses. Promoting investment, including through subsidies if necessary and other arrangements to ramp up production. refrain from buying national policies as they defeat the purpose of that policy outcome that we're trying to achieve. Allow the temporary movement of health professionals, doctors, nurses, and others. Share knowledge via e-health and foster other digital interactions. And finally, ensuring that intellectual property regimes allow access to new technologies, vaccines, and drugs for all. So some of these measures can definitely help countries fight the COVID-19. Now, if we move forward, it is not only, of course, about fighting the virus. Next slide, please. It's not only about fighting this virus, but about helping economies recover. So here, I believe some critical actions, of course, need to keep supply chains moving and trade lanes open. And here, for instance, if one looks at what is happening with transport companies, we find out, for instance, that one of the main products that they have is that their crews have to undergo a lot of quarantine paperwork and stuff, and that is making it more difficult for transport to keep flowing. So this is something to think about in going forward. Another area which is worth looking, because of course it had an impact in the previous crisis, it may be different this time around, but still, given the impact that it has in terms of keep oiling the trade machinery, it's trade finance, the importance of keeping trade finance flowing, enabling FDI expansion, and we have seen some concerns about countries about whether low value assets will be acquired in certain areas. That's something to think about. But overall, most countries will require additional domestic and foreign investment to recover from the virus. And last but not least, support MSMEs in trade, which, as we know, have been some of the hardest hit in this crisis. So next slide. In addition for the virus helping us, the trade policy helping us fight the virus and recover, we also need to think about rebuilding the future. And I think there are a number of areas where new and revised disciplines will become even more present. Digital trade, the world has moved very quickly. This pandemic has moved the world very quickly into the digital space, even more so than before. So disciplines in this area will be increasingly relevant. Disciplines on subsidies, after hearing Simon, I think this needs no explanation. This is something that will require a lot of thought going forward. And finally, I think on stockpiling will become an even more critical issue in preparing for the next pandemic. So what role, next slide, please, what role for global trade cooperation? Because certainly some of these measures can be taken at the national level, but global trade cooperation is important to avoid politically appealing but self-defeating trade policies, to facilitate the reversal of those damaging measures that Simon was pointing out, to enhance trade frameworks for managing crisis, and to address some of the dramatic changes brought about by COVID-19 and the old problems, which we must not forget. So, of course, the ideal is for cooperation to be global, but if this is not possible, then willing countries should step up. And we are seeing some of that happening with initiatives coming out from New Zealand and Singapore, from Canada, and from others. So what are some of these areas where global trade cooperation is important now? I would say that there can be different priorities for sure, but the standstill and rollback of current export bans and restrictions on new measures becomes very relevant. An agreement on health-related products, which could include tariffs, non-tariff barriers, market entry authorizations, and others, a common framework for cross-border movement of health professionals, and a collective understanding on access to new vaccines and drugs. And of course, the WTO is the natural forum for this collaboration. Something can happen, of course, some things can happen at the regional level as well, but things do need to change, starting with increased transparency, which means certainly more notifications and improved operating practices. And of course, COVID-19 does not allow for the waste of time. So in concluding, let me just finalize, next slide, with a reflection, which is that international collaboration on trade has unraveled in the past few years to the detriment of prosperity, but now we have a chance to seize on the crisis to sow the seeds for renewed global trade cooperation. So thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Anabel. And it's great everybody's been keeping the time, so we're doing well on time. If I could see my first slide, I start my video. If I could see the first slide, please, Tamara. So next slide too. So what I wanted, this is the outline of the talk, or what it was going to be, is point one was on the 2008-2009 collapse. And I think I'm going to skip over all those slides because the previous speakers have covered them very well. I'm going to go straight to the point two, which is why this one's different. And lastly, talk a little bit about supply chain contagion and possibility of recontagion waves. So if we can move forward another slide, another slide, another slide. There we go, perfect. One back, please. Okay, so I want to start with this. This one is different. This trade collapse, which in a Vox column I called the greater trade collapse, is different in a couple ways. First one, as in 2008, 2009, there's a large demand element to it. And you saw that a lot in what Bob's forecasts were, is when GDP falls, imports fall, and that leads to fall in trade, which sometimes magnifies the fall. So it's a demand shock, so to speak. But what's new is that this shock was also a supply shock, a very direct express shutting down of factories and ports and transportation nodes in order to fight the virus. So not only did we have a lack of demand, we've also now got a lack of supply, especially quite discoordinated lack of supply. And what's also different about this shock is that it hit all the biggest traders and manufacturers all within a couple of months of each other. So if you look at the top bit of the slide here, the share of world manufacturing, you'll see as usual, China, US, Japan, and Germany are the giant producers. And they, except for Japan, were also ones that were hit hardest by COVID. So this is from a couple weeks ago, and the US was nowhere near as large as it is now. Now the US is accounting for about a third of all new cases. So basic idea that the big economies were all hit by the supply side at the same time is what makes it different. And as a consequence, we're getting different protectionist responses. And we're also, I believe, we're going to see a very, very large drop in trade flows. I hope 30% is the worst, but I worry it could be larger. The third thing is that although there were global value chains back in 2008, the world is more integrated. And this bottom graph here is just looking at the three manufacturing giants, China, Germany, and the United States. And what I've done is look at their dependence, the reliance of their manufacturing sectors on inputs from the other two giants. So what you see in China is that the reliance is not that high, and it hasn't changed so much between 2009 and 2015. Or actually it went up for a while, then it came back down. So China is turning into a fairly normal large country, which is largely self-reliant. They've been producing more and more things at home rather than importing them. In Germany, there's a much larger dependence on imports, expanded especially from China, but also somewhat from the US. And in the US, there's also a much larger dependence, almost all risen from a large increase in dependence of American manufacturing on inputs from China. Now this matters because first China's factory shut down, and then Germany's factory was hit, and now US factory is being hit, and the whole thing may start again. So this interdependence is playing out in a slightly different way. Could I get the next slide, please? Okay, what I want to do here is put a little background in on why this is all happening, and this is a more general talk, just to point out that the recession we're having is an unavoidable public health measure, at least in the rich countries. So if you look at the green is the medical curves and the blue is the economic curves. And if you look at the red curve here, this is what the epidemiological curve, the curve of new cases, would look like if there were no containment policies. Now, since that would overwhelm the hospitals, all the rich countries have taken severe containment policies to flatten the curve, which means you get fewer cases at any one moment, but the whole disease stretches out over time. Now, those containment policies, since they're keeping workers away from work and consumers away from consumption, they're causing an enormous recession. So the containment policy is in essence making the recession much worse. That's that big black arrow pushing it down to the blue curve. And what we've had in the rich countries is a very large economic response pushing those back up, which has also led to a fair amount of subsidies, and that will also affect things going forward. So I'm just pointing out that a lot of the supply shock is not optional. It's a medical imperative. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, I'll skip over this one quickly, just to point out that this is a very unusual recession. Most recessions are caused by a lack of demand, and they're fixed by either cutting interest rates to stimulate investment or by direct fiscal spending to get people spending again. Here, we're shutting down the supply side of GDP at the same time as the demand, and so it's a very difficult one to fix, which is why we have such complicated policies going on. I'll take the next slide, please. Okay, now this one's a little nerdy, but I want to argue that this crisis is way far from over. I believe there's a great deal of whimsical thinking that we will have this wave, we'll get through it, and then we'll start to go back. Personally, I think we're in for a year and a half or maybe 2 years of problems like this. And I think that gives a different dimension to the trade policy response and cooperations that we're going to need to continue to fight this. So I'll do this with some simple math here. Beta is the number of infectious contacts per person who's infected. So the number of new cases in any given period is the number of infectious contacts per infected person. I is the number of infected persons. And S, which is the number of susceptible people, over N, which is a population, gives you the share of the population that is susceptible to getting infected. So the new cases is beta times I times S. Now, people do recover from this disease, usually within 2 or 3 weeks. Most of them do recover. And the new recovery is this rate gamma times the number of infections. So the top of the infections is when the new cases equals the new recovery. And if you just cancel out the I's, you'll see that the share of people in the population who have not had it, in other words, who are still susceptible, as a share of the population, is this gamma over beta. And gamma over beta is exactly equal to 1 over this famous number R0, which has been estimated to between 2 and 3, which says this thing will end or will peak when something between half and 2/3 of the people have got it, which means half or 1/3 have not got it. And we are way, way far away from that. So as long as we relax some of the containment, new waves are going to come. So we're going to continue to see this as a crisis. So I'm not an epidemiologist, but this is something you can read if you do read the epidemiologists, that the subsequent waves are almost certain. So this is in no way over soon. If I could get the next slide. So this slide is just kind of explaining what I was going to do. So I'll take the next slide. So all I'd like to say is that we may be in for multiple waves of supply chain contagion. So to a certain extent, when China shut down, especially Wuhan, which is the center of many global value chains, that stopped the supply to, for example, Hyundai factories. So Hyundai and some Japanese car companies had to shut down because they were not getting parts from China because China was shut down because of the disease. Then they got through it, and now it's going to the US, and the US is having difficulties exporting certain products to China. And then China is also re-importing the infection. So you can see how this idea of supply chain contagion echoing or reverberating around is something that could keep this crisis at front of mind for quite a while. So I will stop right there. Last slide. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll skip this. Next slide after that. Okay, I'll just stop here and thanks for listening. So that is the part of the talk, which is the presentations. And I think we went through them admirably quickly, a huge amount of information. And I've got a few questions coming up. But Tamara, can you share, by the way, can the speakers all come back on to the, put their all videos back on? Simon has his back on, but Bob and Anabel, can you put yours back on? Okay, so now we have the poll results here. Will world trade fall more than now than it did before? and a crushing 90% of them said yes. Will COVID encourage more or less cooperation? And there was very few people who were bold enough to make an answer. Most people, some of this, some of that. So let me just start the Q&A by asking my fellow panelists what you thought about what you would have answered on the second question. That is COVID, because it's a shared experience of all humanity at the same time, going to pull us together and let us cooperate on things like climate change? I mean, once we get beyond the spats of export restrictions, is this going to pull us together? Or is this the kind of shock that's going to tear us apart? Can I start with Anabel, please? Have you had any thoughts on that?
Well, Richard, that's a tough question. I am normally an optimist person, and I would like to think that the magnitude of the crisis is such, the nature, as you're saying, of it being a global crisis that impacts everyone, will maybe have governments think twice. Having said that, I think it will probably not be as rosy, and it would be more of a mixture. It would be a bit more patchy, with some cooperation happening in some areas, and we have seen, and we are beginning to see part of that cooperation. I was very well impressed by the joint declaration by a number of WTO members committing to open trade in agri-food, for example. And I think this is a good example of the type of global cooperation that will be needed. But I also think that we will continue to see some of these measures popping up. And my greatest concern is whether cooperation will be as strong as to reverse some of the damaging measures that have been put in place.
Thank you very much, Anabel. Bob, do you want to go next? I know you're a WTO official, so you'll have to be very careful and optimistic, but if you unmute yourself, maybe you could give us your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Richard. The way I tend to look at this is, I've been asked in the past, will this be deglobalization? I don't think so. I think it's going to be reglobalization. It's going to be a lot of changes and realignments that are likely to come about. I think we've seen a very significant focus by firms on efficiency and less on sort of bringing in this risk aversion aspect. They've assumed that the agreements and that the integration that we've seen over the past 30 or 40 years really reduce their need to think about risk. But I do think now they're going to have to think about it more. I still think that the science that underpins globalization, integration, the Smithian specialization and the Ricardian comparative advantage, that scientific basis isn't going to go away. And at some point, if we do move too far away towards deglobalization, the costs that will come about will become either through slower growth, higher taxes, higher prices, will eventually get people to think about how do we reglobalize, and that we may move right to reglobalization. But I do think there's an economic argument for people to be thinking about how do we recast the global trading system in a way that's more nimble, more flexible, and meets broader competing needs.
Thank you very much, Bob. Simon, any thoughts on kumbaya or go at each other's throats?
I mean, I think your question really comes down to what would it take to shift the mindsets in some of the big capitals of the big players around the world. And after this drip, drip, drip of distrust, and then pile on top of that rushed crisis response and beggar thy neighbor activity, it's a lot to expect that some countries are going to shift, or at least their governments are going to shift dramatically towards cooperation. But we live in hope. I think what we will see, and here I sympathize with Anabel's argument, we will see pockets of countries collaborating, perhaps very successfully in advancing their interests. That may well help in some areas, but on truly global challenges like climate change, it's hard to see how we can turn this around, at least after a crisis like this.
Thank you very much. So I'll throw my 2 bits in on that, and that is I think we are like at the 3rd chapter of an Agatha Christie novel, and people are trying to say they know who done it yet. I think this crisis will look very different in a year's time. I mean, if nothing else, there may be a change of administration in Washington, which would change things greatly. But also, after we go through several waves of crisis and we find out we need to be making each other's personal protective equipment while the fellows' factories all shut down, there may be more of a spirit of cooperation, or there may be clubs of cooperation that sort of emerge from this. So I'm an eternal optimist, and also think deep down people will understand when everybody knows somebody who's died or been very badly affected by this, that there's a commonality of interest. But then again, I'm an optimist. Okay, in the 15 minutes that we have left, I'm going to pick very lightly among all the questions that have come in. We have about 280 participants, and a good number of them have sent in questions. So let me start with something relatively technical. Bob, on your projection. So I noted that it was noted that you did your projection several weeks ago, and there's been the big banks and some of the international organizations have changed their projections for GDP. So would you revise it much up or down, both in terms of the depth, but also the length, because the discussion of the 2nd and 3rd waves has also come up? Bob, you have to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we have competing unmutes going on here, as Tamara does her job very well. Yeah, so actually I'm very comfortable with where we are right now, given what other organizations have put out there, and kudos to my team, Eddie Beckers, Alex Keck, and Coleman Nee. It was a big effort. We had to do that because we weren't getting very good GDP numbers by that point. Normally we rely on other people's. But our model, I think, is very helpful because it gets all this domestic interconnectivity across sectors and across countries. But your point about the potential length of the shutdowns, or sort of a W or repeating W episodes, that's something that we need to reflect on. And as we get more information and understand the epidemiological information better, get more calibrated information for how it's affecting different countries, we're definitely going to go back and revisit this. Certainly for the trade forecast, how much work we do on GDP is going to depend on how other people are doing. We'd rather focus on trade and have other people do the GDP. On the other hand, we get very interesting insights from putting these shocks into the model and looking at how it hits all these interconnections. Very much like that chart you skipped over. Our model, that's pretty much a flow chart for the kind of model that we use. We don't have the liquidity, the financial side in there, but we have a lot of the real sector in there.
Right. Thank you. Just a quick follow-up on that. A lot of the packages in the G7 countries were intended to avoid bankruptcies and shutdowns and disruptions of networks. Most of them, or a lot of them, I mean, is in the service sector, but for trade, it's mostly about manufacturing, at least for the big volumes. Do you see that lasting damage of bankruptcies to networks playing an independent role, or is that something you're going to think about in the future, or how do you think about those bankruptcies?
Well, I think they're going to have an effect. They're going to really, potentially be a drag on the recovery. But again, that depends on how effective these policies are at mitigating that aspect. We did not incorporate into our scenarios effective response. Our model could gather some insights on fiscal policy responses that are hitting demand, but it can't really do much on the liquidity side. Right. That's where you need some of the other kind of DSGE models, those kinds of models, to look at those kinds of questions.
Thank you very much. Simon, there was a question about service restrictions, which you hadn't really touched on, or maybe they were in there. if you unmute yourself, did you have anything particular to say about service restrictions during this particular crisis?
The short answer to your question is no. I have very little to say about it. I think the question is really well taken, because, of course, the hit in this crisis is on so much of the B2C sector. And it will be very interesting to see how governments try and foster the recovery in that sector, and whether they do so discriminating in favor of local firms. So it's certainly something to watch.
Thank you. So just as a plug to the next CTEI seminar we're going to have, Simon Evenett and I are now very feverishly working to finish an ebook on trade policy and COVID, turning inward won't work. That's the title of the book. And in there, we have a chapter by some Norwegians who are following sea transportation very closely. And Anabel mentioned it in passing. But as it turns out, the crew restrictions to contain COVID are having a major impact, turning all sorts of cargo ships into floating quarantines, in particular Singapore. So as it turns out, there's only a few hubs where all these boats stop, and the containment policies and the visa policies in those countries are having a major implication. So let me turn to Anabel with a kind of deeper question. Was, okay, so these export restrictions are not the way to go, but what would have happened if they didn't restrict the exports and trade got blamed for the hospital doctors not having any PPE? If you unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Richard. That's a great question, because for this to work, you need to have increased capacity, increased production, and trade flowing. So it's a combination of the two. So arguably, you know, the increase in demand was so rapid and so strong that there was not enough production of some of these critical products across the world. So there would have been some limitation to start with. But the export bans simply made it much more difficult, because some of these export bans, first of all, some of them do not really cover the protective equipment, and we see very, very sort of, you know, funny things popping up, like a country banning exports of lemon. Lemons are foodstuffs on the one hand, and they can be used as hand sanitizer, as, you know, an input into hand sanitizer. So you see very strange things going on. But in any case, these export bans have made it very difficult, because presumably what you would want to see in a pandemic like this is that the equipment can move from the cool spots, if you wish, to the hot spots. And since this does not, it's not going to last forever, presumably, if you have smoother, trade lanes, it would be easier for this to happen. So some of the places that experience a severe shortfall, maybe it could have been better. Maybe it wouldn't have been as much as we would have needed everywhere all the time. But certainly the export bans would have made it just much worse for everyone, I think.
Right. Let me just add to that there was a WHO report saying that the personal protective equipment output worldwide had to rise 40% to take care of the millions of people who have it, and will continue to rise, because it potentially a couple billion people could get this disease, and all the people taking care of them needs gloves, masks, and goggles. And the reality in this industry is that it's globally integrated. Both the inputs, the precursors, the assemblies, the shipment, it's a completely globalized world. And to think that we can ramp this thing up by an amount of 40%, why we're trying to disrupt these carefully balanced supply chains, I think is really very, very short-sighted. And that I think will come out a little bit later. Yeah. Now, just to wrap that into a question to Anabel, if we are going to have some sort of quick multilateral or plurilateral talks on avoiding trade restrictions and perhaps cooperating on increased production, and even potentially making sure the equipment goes where it needed the most, what would be the venue for that? Your experienced trade negotiator, would it be the WTO? Would it be, where would we have those talks, do you think?
Well, I think, you know, given that the nature of the crisis is global on the one hand, given that production of some critical gear is, you know, in different parts of the world, I would say that although you can think about regional conversations, maybe it will not be enough. And so I'm thinking, for instance, if the whole of Latin America would come together to have a conversation around these things, well, I don't know. This is not the part of the world where a lot of this stuff is produced. So it may be better to bring it to the context of the WTO. Now, mindful of some of the geopolitics that surround some of these conversations, this is why I think that the willing should step up and come together, and through the instrument of the plurilateral agreements, begin to look into these things. I tend to believe that if, you know, if WTO members, you know, sort of park on the side the traditional mercantilist sort of mindset that sometimes impacts these negotiations, we can actually see a lot of countries coming to the table, because a lot of the countries are importers of these things. So, you know, to me, it wouldn't make sense to have a plurilateral with some 90, 100 countries coming into this, all of Africa, all of Latin America, many countries in Asia, Europe for sure. So I see great potential, quite frankly, if we can park our traditional mindset on, you know, on the side for a while.
Thank you. Let me just react to that a little bit to take a bigger swing on that. The trade governance we have now grew up in a world where there wasn't enough demand for things. And so a lot of the restrictions are on restricting imports, which is kind of a demand shifting sort of thing. But they were also written at a time when wartime shortages and embargoes and things like that were front of mind of the people who wrote the European Union and the GATT and all that. So actually export restrictions are relatively legal in these things, because countries weren't supposed to be able to stop from, for example, having an Irish potato famine like thing go on. Now, I think one of the lessons of this is that we can get export restriction spirals that are as damaging to the supply side as the import protection were to the demand side. So I'm hopeful that we'll get, at least in regional trade agreements, mutual pledges not to block exports and trade agreements in times of need. But then again, I'm an optimist. Simon, let me go on to a slightly technical thing, not a technical thing, a big issue, which is reporting of these things. To a certain extent, the unnecessary damage is coming because people don't even know what the other countries are doing. So could you speak to the lack of reporting or lack of transparency and how we might fix that?
Definitely. I mean, what we see is that transparency is a global public good. It takes a lot of the sort of fear and loathing and double guessing out of the business of setting trade policy. And we saw during the last financial crisis, and also now, governments are a little bit slow to send their notifications into the WTO. I must say, the last couple of weeks, there's been a big pickup and things are moving in the right direction, but we're still far short of where we need to be. And here, I think what we need to reconsider whether we're going to rely on governments sending in this information and notifications, or whether the WTO and organizations like the WCO should go and look for that information and publish it, and then publish corrections if they're wrong. I think we need to change the mode in which we acquire this information, so that policymakers can at least make decisions based on more of the facts rather than just perception about what other countries are doing.
Thank you. So Simon, if I can continue on with this, there's a question from Ricardo Melendez-Ortez. How do we square the fear-prompted economic nationalism, in other words, self-sufficiency, and the pre-COVID calls for leveling the playing field on subsidies? I guess what he's hinting at is that if you read the press, we're going to get a wave of subsidies to local production of at least medical equipment. And potentially, by the end of this crisis, a very large number of companies in the G7 will be state-owned enterprises, the airlines, the car companies, et cetera. So how do you see that? Will this shift permanently, or do you think the tone of the debate will change?
I think, I mean, the way to answer that question is to look what happened 10 years ago, which is that we had the crisis. We saw a lot of government intervention. In some sectors, say, take green energy, it's been very, very hard to unwind the subsidies which have been put in place. So there are important legacy effects. And then there were other countries which turned towards variants of state capitalism. I'm thinking of the large emerging markets. So I think this is a great example of how these crises trigger sharp shifts in economic policy making, and they will make it much more difficult for us, I think, to conclude agreements in the area of subsidies, which is, I think, desperately needed. And so I fear, and this will ratchet up the involvement of the state in national economies, the potential for discrimination against foreign commercial interests, and it will further sour trade relations.
Thank you very much, Simon. So I promised to end on time, and it is past. So what we're going to do now is formally close the seminar. But as often happens at seminars face-to-face, the speakers will hang around and answer a few questions for 5 or 10 minutes more. And there was one very important question that I didn't get to, which was raised by quite a number of people. What does this mean for the South, the developing world, the emerging markets? Which of the panelists wants to take that one first? Why don't we all unmute ourselves and have a discussion?
I wanna say a couple of words here. For most developing countries, the health impact of the pandemic is still to be seen, but it's not looking good. For most of them, the measures that will need to be put in place will either not work very well or will have a very strong economic impact. So if I go back to what role for trade policy in helping developing countries fight and recover from COVID-19, I would say that many of these countries should be out there promoting global cooperation on a number of these things. First and foremost, for the rollback and standstill of export bans. Export bans, if I can be very blunt, export bans can kill people in many of these developing countries. I would like to see many of these countries going to the WTO and insisting that we start a conversation around these issues.
Thank you very much. That was clear. Who's next?
I'll take a shot at that. I think we really do need to understand much better sort of the evolution of the pandemic in the South. And then we also need to make sure that things that we're using right now, this is Zoom, I believe, right? And we all have pretty good connections, keeping in mind that the kinds of things that are facilitating at least some economic activity in the developed world are not very available in the developing world, in the least developed world. And what can we do to help close that digital divide? What can we do when it comes to vaccines and medicines to make sure that there's innovation? And one of the things we've observed over the last 30 or 40 years is innovation in the West spreading rapidly in terms of technological change. Richard, you've written books about this, right? I think this is an opportunity to use this crisis to raise the prospect of global cooperation around innovation and helping the South advance and start to close that gap.
Absolutely. A couple points that Simon and I are making in the introduction to our ebook. Did I mention we're writing an ebook? That's going to be the next conference. Is that in fact it's enlightened self-interest, because if this disease becomes really endemic in the developing world, it could lead to a series of reinfection for quite a long time. So I agree very much with that. Simon, do you want to make
just one more thing is I think a lot of emerging and developing countries have taken very sensible steps during this crisis in terms of liberalizing their trade policies, getting rid of taxes on imported soap, which make absolutely no sense. They have also begun to act much more regionally. I was part of a webinar recently where people from East Africa were describing the steps they've taken to facilitate trade and keep open supply routes and the like. I mean, there's a lot of creative responses there, but I do not want to diminish the and the amazing challenges that these countries are going to face, given their inherited health infrastructures and the financing problems they're facing with falling remittances and other concerns. So I think this is an area where we in the North, or the richer parts of the world, really need to reach out and support people and governments in developing countries.
Richard, could I weigh in on something that was brought up before on export restrictions?
Yeah.
One of the things I think is interesting, and I want to put a pitch in for the WTO COVID-19 website. You'll find lots of very good information there. And we have a paper that's either out or coming out on health-related provisions in RTAs. And one of the things that you find in there is even an advanced RTA like CPTPP, they commit to not undertaking export restrictions, except where the WTO allows them to. Okay, so and the WTO, as Richard was pointing out earlier, has these provisions that allow for countries to impose these export restrictions, time limited, transparent, targeted, those kinds of things. But it is important to realize that even advanced RTAs still recognize that there needs to be this kind of political flexibility for national governments to take actions that may not be very good for them in the long term, but they give some comfort to their population that they're doing something. And getting a recognition that we should be looking at the longer term is not going to be an easy one if even leading edge RTAs don't take actions beyond what the WTO is allowing them to do.
Thank you very much. So any last comments from the panelists? If not, I will thank our excellent panelists for spending the time and sharing their wisdom with us. I want to thank the participants for participating. I think one of the amazing things about this crisis is how easy we can put together an incredibly multinational audience to discuss important national issues. And in a week or two, we will have another one based on very specifically on export restrictions, maybe delving a little bit more into some of the things that Anabel said about the renegotiations and Bob said about the trade agreements, and Simon and I have been writing about. You'll hear more about that. I'd also like to thank the fantastic CTEI team led by Tamara Pieranetti, but also Angela Zanzanelli. And I was asked if the slides will be available online. And technically, I don't know whether that's possible, but we'll find a way to make it possible. Almost surely it will be on the CTEI website, which if you just look on the Graduate Institute's website, we are one of the research centers under it. So thank you very much, and I will close it there with a great thanks to all, and see you at the next one.